The sun was dying over the plains that evening, spilling a red-gold sorrow across the dry grass, turning every dust mote into a floating ember. Wind carried the scent of rain that never came, and somewhere near the riverbank a burlap sack lay half-buried in mud. It twitched once, faint as a dying moth, then again, more desperate. A cough broke the silence. A woman's hand, small and trembling, tore through the coarse weave of the sack. Mud clung to her eyelashes as she dragged herself free, gasping. Her name was Evelyn, Eve, as her mother once called her, but no one in town would speak it now. They had left her there, bound and blindfolded, like something unholy the prairie itself was meant to swallow. Somewhere a coyote howled. Eve pressed her palm to the earth as though begging it for strength. Her body ached, bruises mapping where their cruelty had landed. She was 30 years old, but tonight she felt ancient, like a ghost too stubborn to stay buried. She remembered flashes. A barn door slammed shut, the preacher's wife calling her filth, the wagon creaking through the night. Someone spitting the words, "Let the river take her," but the river hadn't taken her. Not yet. At dawn, Rhett Mallory rode the northern ridge, reins loose in his weathered hands. The frost cracked beneath his boots as he dismounted to check for strayed cattle. His horse snorted softly, ears flicking toward the river. That's when he saw it, a torn sack. A pale shape in the mud. Rhett approached, one hand near the revolver at his belt, until he saw a woman's face beneath the grime, breathing. Barely. He cursed under his breath, then dropped to his knees. "Ma'am?" She didn't answer, only trembled. Years of ranch life had taught him when to keep distance from trouble, especially the kind that came in the shape of a woman abandoned by townsfolk. Still, something in her didn't look like sin. She looked like suffering. And suffering wasn't something Rhett had ever been able to ride past. Behind him, a small voice whispered, "Papa, she's not dead." It was Lydia, his 7-year-old daughter, watching from the saddle. Her blonde hair glowed like morning wheat, her eyes wide as the prairie sky. Rhett said nothing. He simply lifted the woman into his arms, feeling the weight of another person's sorrow against his chest for the first time in years. They brought her back to the ranch, a humble cabin crouched against an ocean of grass. Lydia fetched quilts while Rhett stoked the fire. Steam rose from the kettle, carrying the scent of sage and ash. When Eve finally opened her eyes, she saw rough wooden beams above her and a little girl humming softly nearby. For a moment, she thought she'd died and been reborn somewhere gentler. Then she saw Rhett by the fire, hat low, eyes hidden. "Where am I?" she rasped. "My ranch," he replied quietly. "You were by the river," she swallowed hard. "You should have left me there." He didn't look up. Couldn't. The word lingered between them like smoke from the hearth, soft, gray, impossible to grasp. By midday, the prairie carried her story to town like a wildfire. Clara Dempsey, keeper of gossip and imagined righteousness, told the blacksmith. The blacksmith told his wife. By sundown, every porch in Calhoun's Hollow buzzed with scandal. "Rhett Mallory's taken in that sinner woman," they whispered. The sheriff came by, hat in hand, his tone firm but tired. "Rhett, you're a respected man. Ain't wise keeping company with that one. She's trouble the town's already had its fill of." Rhett just nodded, jaw tightening. "You finished, Amos?" "I'm finished." "Then so are we." He closed the door, leaned against it for a moment, the weight of old loneliness pressing into his spine. That night Eve tried to rise, but her legs failed her. Lydia appeared beside the bed, clutching a bowl of broth almost too big for her small hands. "Papa said you need this," the girl murmured. Eve accepted it with shaking fingers. "Thank you," Lydia smiled, small and shy. "You talk pretty." "Like stories do," Eve almost laughed. It had been so long since she'd been spoken to without venom that even a child's kindness felt like mercy. Days stretched like slow rivers, time crawling between dawns and dusks. Eve began to move again, sweeping the floor, mending small things, avoiding mirrors. She still woke at night to phantom voices whispering her shame. But every morning she found a tin cup of tea waiting outside her door, still warm, still wordless. Rhett never mentioned it. Neither did she. When she could finally walk to the porch, she saw Lydia chasing chickens, her laughter carrying across the yard like wind chimes. Rhett stood by the corral, his coat frayed, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He was the kind of man who built fences out of silence, sturdy, tall, and meant to last. Eve began sewing again. First, small patches on Lydia's doll. Then, a new shirt for Rhett, stitched by moonlight, thread steady for the first time in years. When she left it folded by his chair the next morning, she said nothing. He didn't thank her either. But when she saw him later, wearing it while mending a fence, she noticed how carefully he'd rolled the sleeves, as if to preserve every stitch she'd made. In the evenings, they shared quiet meals. Lydia told stories about clouds shaped like ponies and saints. Rhett listened, sometimes smiling, though never long enough to be caught. Once Eve asked, "You don't fear the town talk?" Rhett chewed slowly, eyes on the fire. "I've buried worse things than gossip." His voice was low, steady, but there was pain behind it. Something old, something that hadn't healed. Outside, a coyote howled again, and Eve found herself shivering not from fear, but from recognition. She understood that sound. The cry of something that had once belonged and now lived only on the edges. That night, she stood by the window, the prairie wide and silver beneath the moon. She could see Rhett teaching Lydia to ride near the barn, his laughter rough and soft at once. For the first time since the river, Eve felt warmth uncoiling in her chest. Small, dangerous and alive, hope and far away. The river whispered against its banks, keeping its secret. Winter crept over the plains like a slow bleeding wound. Frost gathered along the corral rails, the horse's breath hanging in white ghosts before fading into the hush of morning. Inside the small cabin, the air felt tighter, thick with something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't peace either. The town had not forgotten Evelyn Calhoun. Whispers curled through Calhoun's hollow like snakes through brush. At the church, Clara Dempsey spoke of purity, her voice bright as broken glass. She told the others how Rhett Mallory had let sin under his roof, how the woman by the river had bewitched him with shame and stitched it into his house. By the week's end, a small mob gathered, torchlight flickering across cold faces, righteousness burning hotter than mercy ever could. They reached the ranch at dusk. The snow crackled beneath their boots as they shouted for Rhett to come out. Inside, Lydia clung to Eve's skirt, trembling. Eve's heart thundered. She had known this rhythm before, the rhythm of rejection, of people deciding she didn't deserve to breathe their air. Rhett stepped outside, hat low, shoulders squared. "You've come to my door," he said evenly, "so speak plain." Clara lifted her chin, her breath visible in the frigid air. "That woman don't belong here. She was cast out, and you know why. We aim to see her gone again." Eve came to the threshold, pale against the firelight behind her. Her voice was soft, but carried farther than it should have. "If you mean to drive me out, then let it be quick. But don't let the child see it." Something in her tone, worn but unbroken, made even the sheriff hesitate. For a long moment, only the wind answered. It swept through the torch flames, bending them low, scattering sparks like frightened fireflies. Then Rhett's voice cut through, rough as gravel but steady. "There's no sin under this roof. Only folks trying to live." No one spoke after that. The mob broke apart slowly, their righteousness paling against the cold. Clara was the last to turn away, her face pinched and hollow beneath her bonnet. When the last footstep faded, Rhett exhaled, a sound between relief and sorrow. Inside, Lydia ran to Eve, wrapping her small arms tight around her waist. "Don't be scared," she whispered. "Papa's here." Eve's knees nearly gave out. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be defended, to be worth standing in front of. Tears blurred her sight as she sank to the floor beside the child. "I'm not scared," she murmured, though her voice trembled. Not anymore. That night, the ranch slept uneasy. The fire burned low. Somewhere before dawn, Lydia stirred, caught between dream and waking. She heard a woman's humming, soft, tender, a lullaby she hadn't heard since she was a baby. The melody wrapped around her like a familiar scent. She sat up in bed, whispering to herself, "Mama?" Morning broke pale and gold. Lydia ran to Rhett's room, tugging at his arm. "Papa," she said breathlessly. "She's Mama." Rhett froze, the words striking him deeper than any bullet. He sat up, eyes searching the child's face. "What did you say?" "She sang the same song, Papa, the one from when I was little. The one Mama used to sing." His chest tightened until he couldn't speak. He rose, pulling on his coat with hands that shook. The years seemed to fall away, years of quiet grief, of wondering if he'd driven her off or buried her memory wrong. He found Eve in the barn, mending Lydia's coat by the lantern's glow. The air was still except for the soft rasp of her needle through fabric. She didn't look up when she said, "They came close tonight, didn't they?" He swallowed hard. "Lydia said something to me?" Her hand froze mid-stitch. "She said you're her mama." The needle slipped from her fingers. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, in a voice barely louder than the creak of the lantern chain, she answered, "They told me you wanted me gone, that you'd sent word, that you called me a disgrace." Rhett's throat worked, words failing before they found shape. "Eve," he said at last, her name sounding like prayer and apology at once. "I never stopped waiting by that river. Not a day." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full. Full of all the years between them, of the life they could have had and might still have if they were brave enough to claim it. Eve lifted her eyes to his, and in that small, wordless moment, forgiveness passed between them like the whisper of wind through wheat. The next morning, Rhett saddled the horses before dawn. He told Lydia to wrap up warm and took both of them down to the riverbank. The frost sparkled across the mud like broken glass, and the water moved slow beneath its thin skin of ice. Eve stood there trembling, not from the cold but from memory. She knelt where her sack had once lain. Her fingers traced the earth, still scarred from that night. "It's strange," she murmured, "how a place can hold both death and beginning." Rhett knelt beside her. He held a small wildflower Lydia had picked, its petals stubbornly bright against the pale morning. Together they buried the scrap of burlap he'd kept, the same one that had held her body captive, now laid to rest like a ghost finally given peace. Lydia placed her tiny palm atop theirs. "Now it's over," she whispered. A single tear rolled down Eve's cheek, but her smile was steady. She looked at Rhett, and in his eyes she saw not pity or shame, but recognition, the kind of love that grows quietly, like roots beneath frozen ground. When they rode back, the sun had fully risen. The frost melted off the fences, the horses' manes catching light like spun silver. For the first time in years, Eve didn't feel like something the world had thrown away. In town, tongues wagged again, but softer now. Clara Dempsey saw Eve one morning outside the general store, helping an old widow mend her shawl. Clara's mouth opened to speak, but no words came. For the first time, she bowed her head instead of lifting her chin. By spring, the prairie had forgiven everything. Grass grew over the old river scars. The ranch was quieter, fuller somehow. Eve's laughter returned, slow and cautious, as if afraid of echoing too far. Rhett still didn't speak much, but every time he brushed past her shoulder or set an extra cup of coffee on the table, something wordless bloomed between them. At dusk, Lydia liked to sit by the fence, watching the horizon fade into gold. Sometimes she'd tug at Eve's sleeve and ask, "Tell me the story again, how Papa found you." And Eve would smile softly, her eyes turning to where the sky met the earth. "He found what the world threw away," she'd say, "and gave it a home." The wind would lift her hair, and for a heartbeat, it was as though the land itself was breathing with her. Out here, where the sky has no edge and the earth keeps every story, mercy doesn't come loud or proud. It comes like a whisper, a child's voice saying, "Papa, she's Mama." And for those who listen, that's enough to bring the dead parts of a soul back to life. So if you ever find yourself cast aside, remember this. Sometimes the river keeps what others try to drown. Sometimes it carries you home instead.